started with the beginning, and then later throughout the years, we opened this museum in 2000, and then we incorporated the lighthouse, which was started with the beginning of the 1997, but it was restored in 2000 also. So today we're going to share with you some of the history of the shrimping and fishing industry by Mike Atera. He's the president of the board of museums, and he's also come from a family that has started the shrimping industry here in Port Isabel. Mike?
Thank you, Ed. First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming today. We're very proud of our museum and the fact that this is our 10th year anniversary. What I'm going to be speaking about today deals with our fishing heritage of the area in total, and it goes way back. To start historically, we have to say that the Native Americans that were living here at the time and occupied the lower Laguna Madre, and also the Laguna Madre that goes further into across the river into Mexico. Those Indian tribes that are Native American people that live here depended very heavily on the Laguna Madre bay system for fish, for crabs, for oysters, for all types of various seafoods. If we come up in time, we trace our heritage back to all the way back to the early 1500s, whenever the Spanish exploration started in the New World. Historically, in 1519, Pineda, one of our Spanish explorers that found this area, set up an encampment for around 40 days, and thought at that time, in 1519, that Point Isabel, where we are here at the Fronton d'Isabel, or present-day Port Isabel, was going to be the new government of Spain. So that, in history, goes back quite a long ways. Our little town or village and our community that we have today, its roots start, from actually the early 1500s. The fishing and seafood heritage that we have here, one of the things that attracted the explorers that came into the area was the fresh water that they could obtain, and also to forage for food. It wasn't a general store type atmosphere where every time they did come in from the Gulf of Mexico into the Laguna Madre did they find fish to eat, but there are reports and documentation where some of the American native Indians had dried fish that they would barter and trade with. There's not very much documentation on that, but it is added into the the historical effects of the beginning of this area down here. Excuse me. When we travel a little bit later in time, and we come into the colonization, the true colonization of the Southwest, which comes up into the 1700s. There was a mass colonization that came from all over the world, besides the destination of being Mexico. The Texas coast, and especially the lower Laguna Madre area where we are today, was also, again, the importance was the passage from the Gulf of Mexico into the interior of the territories. The bay system here, again, it provided food, and the food that could be caught, and the settlements and the fishing villages all up and down the Laguna Madre, especially here in the Port Isabel area, because of its access to the Gulf. And that's the Brazos Santiago Passage, which is what we know today as our jetties when you go to South Padre Island. That pass that comes from the Gulf into the Laguna Madre Bay has been there since the beginning of time. So the sailing ships are visitors, everyone who was in the migration period was able to fresh water and the food that they could catch or that they could find here in Laguna Madre was the fish and the crustaceans. The bays were very shallow and the same as they are today, and the ease of catching enough to eat was just overwhelming. In other words, there was never really a problem for them, I guess, refurbishing their supplies as far as food, and that's really what fishing is all about. I want to kind of hop, skip, and jump around a little bit because I am limited on my time, so I want to really go through the kind of the whole scope of our fishing heritage historically. When we come up into the 1800s, the early 1800s up to the mid 1850s, there was a big transition. There had been several fishing villages that had been set up and were prosperous, and because of storms and natural catastrophes and things, they had depleted, they had disappeared, and they had reappeared. But in the early 1800s and up to the 1850s, there were true settlements here in the Fronton de Isabel, which is what this area was called, and the whole concept was that the people who lived here, from northern Mexico, some of the Tejanos, of all races and nationalities that had settled here in this part of the Southwest, Laguna Madre area, set up these settlements and set up this settlement here based on the Laguna Madre and what they could catch and how they could feed themselves. As early as 1830s and 1840s, there was actually a commerce and a trade between Port Isabel, what we know today as Port Isabel, and Galveston and New Orleans, and that was fish that were being caught during the season, because it's not something necessarily all 12 months out of the year. The fish were being salted, and they were dried, sun-dried, placed, and then they were packed in barrels. And sailing ships that would come into the harbor here, into the Laguna Madre, would actually take them all the way back to Galveston and New Orleans as a trade item. The people were fishermen. They were very poor. There was a subsistence type of living for them. But the beginning of the 1840s into the 50s, it started to gradually grow. In other words, instead of spending their time catching what they could catch and bringing it back to feed their families, now they were able to get some monetary value out of it. And it wasn't a big business, it wasn't a booming industry, but it was a beginning. In the 1860s and 70s, the historical beginning of some of the shrimping actually got started. The bays that we have here, starting from around April to July, is kind of the beginning of the seasonal growth of all of our shrimp species down here. Shrimp was very easily caught, and it was in such abundance, it was just astronomical. People could go out with their seines, and they did have seines at that time, and just catch more shrimp than they could eat. So what they did was that because of the salt also in the area, which was very important, we had salt that was collected as a trade commodity. The shrimp were being parboiled and saline or real very salty solution, and then sun dried. And when you do that, it's pretty much preserved for, well, not forever, but it'll last a long time. And in 1870 was really the first earmark for the real true trade between Galveston and New Orleans, and from the sun-dried shrimp that we had that was coming from Port Isabel. There was an actual factory, we'll call it, that was set up to the north end of the town, close to where the yacht club is today, and that housed a facility that had, I've got a picture here, you're all welcome after to come look at these pictures. This is a cauldron that would probably hold about 300 to 400 pounds of shrimp, and it's a big iron pot that they built a fire underneath, and they would actually cook the shrimp with the salt and then take them out and sun dry them, and it usually takes about 3 to 4 days if the weather's right to dry the shrimp. And after that, then they're completely cured. And the reason that it was very important, or it became very important to this area, was because the dried shrimp was used as a condiment. You really couldn't eat. You could eat a lot, I guess, and make a meal out of it. It takes, they're very, very small, and it would take quite a few to actually make a meal out of it. But it was used in soups. It was used in rice dishes, and more of a condiment in the very beginning than it was like a full meal, I guess, to explain it like that. So the early accounts that we have for shrimping, and also the fish that were being caught down here in the markets, we're not sure where they went once they got to New Orleans, got to Galveston, but they did travel by sailing ship from this little port, from this actual fishing village, up to the northern ports. When we get into the early 1900s, we have kind of a complete turnaround. And starting in 1870, the Rio Grande Railroad started, and the railroad was completed in the early 1870s. And there was a company that started up in Brownsville, Texas, that was the Southern Pacific Ice House, ice company, and they were the first to actually start producing ice. The problem was, and it always has been with seafood, is that once it's caught, the day it's caught, something needs to be done with it. And in the early days, there was no such thing as refrigeration or the freezing process that we have today. So this was an idea, and it didn't work very well. Matter of fact, it didn't work at all. But ice was being brought from Brownsville by the railroad in big blocks, and they would try to ice it down and get it back to Brownsville. And that was the fresh fish that were being caught. And it was kind of a 50-50 thing. Not until probably the 1910, 1920s did, I'm not sure really the innovative ways or differences that they, things that they changed to get their product out of here, but in the the teens and the 1920s, there was a considerable market in the Brownsville area and all the way up to Monterey, and I think that the completion of the railroad had a lot to do with that. The secret was not the fish and the seafood that were being caught during the summer months, which is the prime season. It was the fish that were being caught during the winter months, because of from 100 degrees down to maybe 60 or 70 degrees temperature, ice would last a lot longer. So again, they go back to using wooden barrels, and they're trying to pack fresh fish in wooden barrels with ice, and it was kind of a trial and error to see just how far they could get them. Well, in Texas, the most northern market was San Antonio. Northern Mexico was all the way to Monterey. So they were successful during the winter months of the year when our temperatures down here, our climate is a lot cooler. Ice lasted much longer. That was really pretty amazing that concept was, the ice was made available, and the concept came to be that was really the beginning of the true commercial fishing in the Port Isabel area. I know everyone likes shrimp. I love shrimp. I grew up, my family, I'm fourth generation attached now. I'm not in commercial fishing anymore, but shrimping was something that was very incidental. It was an accident that had happened. The commerce here, of course, were the fish that were being caught in the Laguna Madre Bay. The shrimp was something that was being caught in the bay at the time, and mostly went home to the people who lived here. They had plenty of it. They fed themselves. They dried the shrimp when they were, the very small shrimp, which were during those seasons. But it still didn't pay any money. Shrimp was probably $0.25 per pound during that time. Fish would bring them 3 or 4 cents a pound. Much more advantageous to go and spend your time trying to catch fish and hopefully get it to the market, without spoiling, versus shrimp. So in 1937, there was it wasn't a closure, but it was a depletion of the shrimping that was known on the east coast of the U.S., and that was from Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and the eastern coast of Florida. The shrimp just kind of disappeared. So we have a migration of family fishermen that started from the upper east coast that kind of migrated around to Florida and then later into the Gulf of Mexico. And not until that really happened did the shrimping industry start to generate here on the Texas coast, especially here in Port Isabel. Between 1937 and around the beginning of World War II, 1941, 1942, shrimp again didn't have a price. It's a very perishable item, and it was hard to catch it and have a facility, which there were very few facilities that could hold the shrimp until they could get it to the market. It just didn't have a price. So after World War II, there was kind of an explosion of the idea of shrimp, and everybody wanted shrimp. Everyone looked to the lower Laguna Madre, especially the Port Isabel area, because there was so much of it here. It's a crustacean that grows. I mean, it's born, it lives, and it dies within anywhere from a 10 to a 14-month period. It's not a creature that lives for a long time and then reproduces. So each year it replenishes itself. In Port Isabel, this particular part of the Gulf of Mexico just had an overabundance of shrimp. Because of World War II, though, we have to say that the new inventions of ice making, of ammonia being used in freezers, which meant that they had storage now to actually catch the shrimp and freeze it and store it for several days before it could be shipped. Not until that, and not until after World War II, were we able to actually go out as a business and as an industry start to catch shrimp, be able to package them in a box or a bag, freeze them, and then transport them to whatever market. And believe it or not, we probably in this area in the very beginning sent more shrimp to Florida, than any other place in the United States. Later, because of the new rail system, everything was by rail system, and also the beginning of trucking in the late 1940s. In 1947, 1948, trucking became very big. So then the markets of Chicago and New York opened up. And that's whenever price shot through the roof. I mean, the price of shrimp shot through the roof. We from looking at 1/4 cent to maybe 10 or 12 cents a pound, now we were looking at 35 to 40 cents a pound for shrimp. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but back whenever beef was maybe 11, 12 cents a pound, and now shrimp was up at 35, 40 cents a pound, it was pretty inviting to want to get into that business if you could. The shrimping business really took off or exploded again in the 1950s. pretty much everyone who had previously been a commercial fisherman anywhere else on the eastern seaboard and the rest of the Gulf of Mexico were migrating to Texas, and their target was Port Isabel and also the Brownsville port at that time. And to give you an idea of some of the diversity and the different nationalities of fishermen that actually lived here, you could get on the dock. Well, this is where the shrimp boats would tie up, and start at one end of the dock and go to the other. And as you walked the whole length, which is probably about 1.5 miles of dock that we had in Port Isabel, you would hear Portuguese, you would hear French, you would hear. We had Estonians from Estonia that settled here. We had our Hispanics, our fishermen from Mexico that had migrated up. It was just a melting pot. It was a tremendous melting pot of fishermen. The Greeks that loved the sponge fishing in Florida came and started shrimping here. So it was such a diverse melting pot of people, and that was the great thing about it. There was always a competition between the different fishermen, because when I went out fishing and you went out fishing, it was a competition to see who caught the most shrimp or fish or whatever at the time, and that's the way it is today. It's just a thing. But the cooperation, the brotherhood that they had, when one was in trouble, the other would help the other one out. It didn't matter if you had a bigger boat and you caught more shrimp or caught more fish and made a little bit more money that particular trip. Your brother, which was not your brother, was always there to help in times that that you might have needed it. During the winter months, and this was pretty much kind of a rule of thumb with fishermen. In the winter months was a time that the boats would tie up and they would do a lot of maintenance. You painted your boats, you fixed your nets, just general stuff like that. Only because the time was wrong to be fishing. The shrimp were not there. The fishing had died down to where it wasn't profitable. So everyone kind of helped each other out. They would kind of like a barn raising. And it was time to paint Mr. Smith's boat, so everybody went over and helped him do that. When they finished with his, they would go to the next one, and his nets needed mending, and he needed this and that carpentry work. So that's the way it was in this community, or in this small port, back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Modernization comes in the 1960s, and it's completely different. We go from wooden boats to steel boats, and to give you a little bit of an idea of how shrimping or the life of a commercial fisherman was at the time. In the very beginning, and you go back to the late 30s, a boat would leave in the morning before daylight and would come back in the afternoon, and generally as late as he could stay out before he had to come back, or if he filled the boat up with shrimp, which a lot of times they did, that's his day's work. The shrimp were being headed and taken care of, and the community, and that was mostly the housewives, the mothers and the children, during the summer months, and a lot of them even during the school year didn't go to school when the shrimp was plentiful, because they were the ones doing the work during the nighttime. The husbands, early in the morning, before daylight, the boat would go back out and come back in. Then, as the modernization gets started, where the boats are able to now, there's a compartment on the boat that's called the ice hold. And since ice was very cheap and there was a lot of it and it was very attainable, that meant that the boat could go out for 6 or 7 days, because they would take the shrimp, put them on ice, or pack it on the boat in ice. They could stay out that period of time, come in with much more shrimp. When they come back in, it gave them an excuse to stay at home a few more days. So That was the concept that developed in the 1940s. And during the 50s and the 60s, the boats got bigger. They could carry more ice, more fuel for the engines. Then the trip would usually, the duration would be up to 14 or 15 days at sea. And that was only as long as the ice would hold up. If the ice started to deplete, then they needed to come back. And the late 1960s and early 70s wasn't really a new innovation, but it was something that was borrowed from another fisheries. Boats were being equipped with a freezer system, and this meant that it was a considerable amount more work to alter your shrimp boat to the freezer capacity. But when they did that, that meant that the shrimp, fresh caught, could be frozen, quick frozen, and they could stay not 14 days, but they could stay 30 days. If you look at some of the trips that are made today, those boats, because their fuel capacity and their capacity to hold their product, will be gone sometimes 2 months and sometimes up to 3 months at one time. So I mean, it's modernization from the beginning to the end, and unfortunately, we have a heritage that's slowly dying, it's disappearing, and that is our commercial fisheries. It's due to a lot of things, and not to point out any one in particular incident. I have to make the comparison of our fisheries to the Midwest farmers back in the 1980s, whenever prices were going up through the roof, mortgages couldn't be made, imports were coming in, and family farms were getting sold. The same is true today with our shrimping industry. It has a lot to do with foreign imports and the fuel cost. And by the way, the shrimp price today, wholesale to the producer or to the fisherman, is less than it was 25 years ago. Now, when you go to the market and buy a pound of shrimp, you're paying more than way much more than it was sold for 25 years ago. Shrimp is tremendous in price per pound, but the fisherman himself today is getting actually less money today than they were getting paid 25 years ago. It's incredible. And it has a lot to do with with our foreign imports. We have a lot of farm-raised shrimp too. That's aquaculture that's coming, but that's modernization. And I'm limited on my time today, but I just wanted to kind of touch some of the high points of our fishing and our heritage. I can't forget to mention our sports fishermen that we have down here. We have the Texas International Fishing Tournament, which was at one time, the beginning was called the Tarpon Rodeo, and that was 78 years ago. We've always had commercial fishing. We've also had a tremendous group interested because of where we are here today with our sports fishing. Today, it's probably as far as our tourism that we attract to the area, our sports fishing is probably the most important asset that the Laguna Madre, well, not the most, but one of the most important attributes that we have to the Laguna Madre. Again, it all comes from the mother Gulf of Mexico and also our Laguna Madre Bay. I'll kind of end it short like that.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions?
It's something that...
Was your family in the shrimping business years back?
Pardon me?
Your family, was it in the shrimping business years
Well,
back?
it was my grandfather, my father, myself, but then my great-grandfather was a fisherman from Barcelona. Okay, so that's the fourth generation. I'm only I'll say 3 generations here in Port Isabel, but I was actually a 4th generation in the shrimping industry. My grandfather was didn't speak English, spoke Spanish, French, or Catalan, and I gotta tell you the story, it's kind of an interesting thing. My grandfather kicked him out, his father kicked him out of the house because he married my grandmother, so, and how he really didn't find Port Isabel first, but he did find Port Isabel. There was a fishing camp, and they called it camp, but it was a village in La Pesca, Mexico. And there were probably more European-oriented fishermen there than any other fishermen that actually were in La Pesca, Mexico. And that's about 120 miles south of here. That's where he actually began. And then from there, the migration was to this area here, or El Pontón, or Point Isabel, because it was another fishing village. And during that time, the Rio Grande River wasn't a border. It was a border, but it was not really a border that was paid much attention to. You crossed, you went